Ambassador Jenny Hill, descendants of Guttorms J. Guttormsson, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. We are very happy to see you here today, and we are holding the International Guttorms J. Guttormsson lecture series in the memory of the poet, avant-garde playwright, musician, and farmer Guttorms J. Guttormsson, who during his lifetime was referred to as the poet of New Iceland. I always say the name in Icelandic. I don't know if you are used to it like that, but I always do it like this. And Alda Ireland, daughter of Bergljót Guttormsson Sigurðsson, Guttorms' third daughter and former honorary consul general of Iceland for British Columbia and Júkon. Heather, you are the benefactor of the lecture series, and we greatly appreciate your support, the long-standing support to the University of Iceland and friendship in addition to that. Heather has been a most valued collaborator also during the University of Iceland's fundraising campaign for the Stefán G. Stefánsson Endowment Fund in 2016. Together with her late husband, William Ireland, Heather Alda was instrumental in assisting us, the University of Iceland, during the application process that secured the University of Iceland as a registered donee in Canada. That status is very, very valuable, and your support and William's really made the difference. And it's interesting to note that at that time, at least, I mean, things have changed a little bit here in Iceland. The University of Iceland didn't have a donee status in Iceland. So we really appreciate this. We are immensely grateful for all of this, including the fact that today we are in company of more than one descendant of Guttorms. The following individuals crossed the Atlantic with Heather Alda: Dr. Ronald Clark. Are you willing to stand up just to let people know that you're here? Caleb Gardner and Jordan Christine Sayer. That's enough. So, very warm welcome to you. As I told you, it's unseasonably cold here today, I think, but we are very happy, and you are happy about the sunshine, so welcome. The lecture series is held in collaboration with the Vigdís International Center of Multilingualism and Intercultural Understanding, which operates under the auspices of UNESCO. As was the case with other major authors of Icelandic Canadian literature, Guttorms J. Guttormsson only wrote in Icelandic. However, different from other authors like Stefán G. Stefánsson, Undína, and Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason, who all arrived in North America during the exodus from Europe in the 19th century, Guttormur, the son of Icelandic immigrants, was born in Canada and lived there all his life. Hence, the far-reaching intercultural enterprise one encounters in his work. The International Guttorms J. Guttormsson Lecture Series was inaugurated last year in 2023 by the Canadian poet, classicist, translator, and essayist Anne Carson, the 2023 laureate of the International Vigdís Prize. This year, the lecture is given by Dr. Magnús Þór Þorbergsson, a scholar of theater and currently a dramaturg at the Reykjavík City Theater. No stranger to the transatlantic legacy of Guttorm's unique plays, Magnús Þór conducted his postdoctoral research into the history of theater among Icelandic settlers of North America, and the excitement for this lecture has been mounting on both Canada's west coast and in Reykjavík. So we very much look forward to your lecture. This would also be the moment to thank Andrew McGillivray, Associate Professor at the University of Winnipeg, the University of Iceland's Professor Ármann Jakobsson, and the University of Iceland's Research Specialist and former Chair of Icelandic at the University of Manitoba, Birna Bjarnadóttir, members of the lecture series board. And Birna, special thanks to you. You have been organizing so many things related to our connection to Canada and North America in relation to the poets. And we are at the University of Iceland very much appreciate that. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Jenny Hill, another most valuable collaborator in the University of Iceland's transatlantic cultural enterprise, to the podium. And then, when the ambassador has given her remarks, the Master of Ceremonies, Birna Bjarnadóttir, will take over. So, Jenny, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Jenny Hill. I'm Canada's ambassador to Iceland. I've been here about 3 months, so I'm still pretty new here in Iceland. But when I learned that I had this new job coming here, and was in, I was in Africa for 9 years before coming here. But when I was in Ottawa, right before coming and receiving, we get briefings before we come out. And one of those things, which I was starting to understand through my own reading, was about all of these connections between Canada and Iceland. And I will admit, I didn't actually know that. And I think it's been, and I started to read this, and I know it's the 150th anniversary of the Great Migration from Iceland to Canada next year, and there'll be lots of celebrations around that. And the more that I've learned about all of the connections between Canada and Iceland, I realize just how rich that is, and it's been really wonderful to be engaged with the university and to come to events like this and hear from people, because it really, once you hear people talk about it, you see photos of their family, you hear their stories, it brings it all to life for somebody like me who's learning. So just thank you so much to everybody for the work and energy and time that you put into this and keeping all of these memories alive. It's really such a joy for me to be able to learn more about this and then be able to speak to it to others as well. I think today I'm delighted to meet the former honorary consul. I'm from British Columbia myself, so that adds another special layer for me. And in a sort of maybe Icelandic tradition, my mom actually owned a bookstore that I worked in for many years myself, which I was just saying, you were asking, how did I join the Foreign Service? And it was through literature that I had an interest in international issues, and my family wasn't able to travel very much, but books and stories were what created my own interest in international issues, and here I am today, having lived in 7 different countries around the world. So, so that literature and books and history is so important. And then my dad was a fisherman, so I think that for whatever reason, my time in British Columbia with my family brought me full circle to Iceland, where I feel a very natural fit for my own background. So, just all of that to say thank you to the university. Thank you for the scholarship that goes into these works that are done, and the history that all of you continue to maintain. I'm really looking forward to the lecture today. Thank you.
Takk kærlega. Ég að tala líka við meistarana hérna uppi. Ekki örugglega í lagi með hljóðið af því að við erum líka, við ætlum að eiga upptöku af þessu. Flott. Oh, thank you so much, Rektor. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to introduce the next speaker, Alda Ireland, as noted by Jón Atli. She's the benefactor of the University of Iceland's Guttorms J lecture series, and is a driving force in celebrating Guttorms' legacy in the transatlantic region, and we are fully aware of our good fortune in being able to collaborate with her. She's the daughter of Jóhannes Sigurðsson and Bergljót Guttormsdóttir, and she's the granddaughter of Guttormur J. Guttormsson, Jensína Júlía Danielsdóttir, Sigfús Sigurðsson og Sigurlaug Jónsdóttir. Born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where she grew up. She received from the University of Manitoba a Bachelor of Arts degree, a teaching certificate, and a Licentiate of Music, for which she won the gold medal. She taught English and music at Westwood Collegiate in Winnipeg, and as a mezzo-soprano, she sang on radio, television, in concert halls and churches, and she also sung in Iceland, on radio, and in 2 recitals. Following a move to West Vancouver, British Columbia in 1970, she joined the Vancouver Opera Chorus and the Vancouver Chamber Choir, the city's first professional choir, where she was singing solos, where she sings solos and in the chorus. She is an associate of the Royal Conservatory of Toronto and a recipient of Iceland's Order of the Falcon. In 1994, she was appointed Honorary Consul of Iceland for British Columbia and the Yukon, and she was promoted to Honorary Consul General in 2005, a position she held until 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Heather Alda.
Almost too much information. Good. Háttr gestur, kæra vinir. I'm very happy and privileged to be speaking to you today. I've been looking forward to it for so many weeks that all of a sudden, here we are. My grandfather, I'm thrilled to speak about. He was a great influence in my life. And as I say in my notes here, I'll tell you a little bit about Guttormur Jónsson Guttormsson, poet, playwright, orator, a truly remarkable person. As you heard, I grew up in Winnipeg, and the dominance of the influence on me was the Icelandic Canadian community, because West End Winnipeg was heavily populated by that group of people. And I think back to going to the church, the first Lutheran church there had Icelandic services for the pioneers and their children. Now no longer do so, but they had a young people's group, and of course it was my generation of children, and we bonded at that time. I'm going to see my Ave in Riverton, Manitoba. Just took about an hour's drive, so we went there quite often. It was always a thrill to go to visit them. I think of them as pioneers, at least Ave's mother and father were. They arrived in 1876, and they called their farm Víðivöllum. So Víðivöllum was visited every summer. They had a tremendously difficult beginning. It was Jón Guttormsson Jón Guttormsson and his wife. This is what happens when you get to my age. You can't get that word in. Paulina Ketilsdóttir was my langamma. Anyway, they named the place Víðivöllum and had a most horrific beginning. They had floods, they had grasshoppers, flies, dangerous diseases, and they survived. And Ave was a a orphan at the age of 16, which made a terrible pressure on him to survive. And he did so by going out into the other farms and helping other farmers, both in Riverton and further away. So I think of them, when I think of them, I think of these hardships that they had to experience. But Ovid never let the hardships thwart his learning. He went to the town of, where was he? Shoal Lake, Manitoba. They had a library, and that was the beginning of his education after leaving school. He devoured the books of American authors and Canadian authors and European authors. And so that is how he educated himself through those difficult times. In Shoal Lake, he met Jensine Danielsdottir, and they fell in love, were married, and moved to Vidavetta. I was always told about Avi going to Iceland on 2 occasions as a guest of the government, once in the 1930s. It must have taken an awfully long time, but anyway, he went there because they wanted to give him, in recognition of his work, a Grand Knight Commander with Star of the Order of the Falcon, that much higher than the Order of the Falcon that I received, and showed the feelings that they had towards him as being so important to Iceland. And then he was awarded a gold medal, and I quote, "in recognition of his contribution to the enrichment of Icelandic literature and language." High praise for a farmer in Riverton. Avi would be amusing to be with as you walked around in his farm because he was a great whistler. He could whistle all the bird songs, and then he'd tell you what bird it was. Of course, we would try to copy him, but were never successful. He was a musician, as they mentioned earlier, and taught himself to play the cornet. And he became a conductor of the 20-person band in Riverton. So there was another part of his life that was very important to him. So we would walk with him, and he would also tell us stories about his early days. And the natives in that time, he said, would come down the river which bordered the property of Vidavetta, and they would be dressed in their beads and bright colors, going in their canoes down the river to the town to sell their wares or trade. And to hear about that time in our history by somebody who was still living, it was amazing. Anyway, he was very, very complimentary of the native people. He said that it was their help, their concern for the new immigrants, that the immigrant community survived, because they taught the Icelanders how to cope with the environment. The frozen lake, which you don't see here, except today we saw the lake is frozen, but they didn't fish through the ice, and they also didn't know how to deal with these giant trees that Canada has in abundance. So he said it was the chief Ramsay and the tribe that helped the Icelanders survive. Avi told people that he didn't work on poetry. He would be walking in his farm, and it would come to him. He would just have the whole poem in his mind when he just had to go into the house and write it down. And I had a farmer, a neighbor, come to me once and say, "That's absolutely true. I was standing there watching him, and he stayed absolutely still for the longest time." And he was obviously creating a new poem. he would go home to write it down, and in his room he called his den. We children were not allowed to go into the den unless he was there. And I understood why, because it was filled with books on bookcases, on shelves, everywhere you could look, paper, envelopes, letters, and of course all these books. So he kept his den in the way that he wanted it to be. And it was a place, the house became a place where visitors came from all over, from Iceland and further afield even, to visit him. And they would converse in the living room. And my mother told me that they talked about all the subjects you could imagine, and enjoying, while they did so, a nice glass of scotch, because they all, or most, would bring a bottle along with them when they came to visit Guttorm, who was nicknamed Gutti. Everybody called him Gutti. Anyway, while this was going on in Víðfellum, I was learning music. I didn't get the poet gene. I guess I got a music one, and it could well be from Paulina Kettlestoter, who apparently had a lovely voice and sang to the boys. Anyway, I did that and got my music degrees and would give recitals, and I always included Icelandic songs in my concert repertoire. And that would usually be Sandi Bar, which was a beautiful composition for that, and Golden Note. So the time came when I was thinking about my grandfather and why nobody understood what he was writing, being all English speaking. I did a cassette, remember those little cassettes we did, called Komin Heim. And that was sort of a tribute to Amanabi, because I sang some of their favorite songs, like Draumalandið and As ég elska þig. So I can sing in Icelandic. I've learned to do that, but alas, conversing in it didn't happen. In August, the Icelandic Canadians all go to Íslendingadagurinn in Gimli. And you mentioned that the big celebration was going to be this coming year, 150 years since the Icelanders first arrived on the shores of Manitoba, which was then called Icelandic River Northwest Territories, the place where they came. So most years, the Guttorms family was at Íslendingadagurinn, and Avi would be the guest speaker. He had the people eating out of his hands. He was very funny and very very clever in how he gave his speeches. They all loved it. They clapped very strongly and laughed a lot. And I would be sitting there thinking, gee, that he's my grandfather. You know, that's really nice. I was very proud of him. One day I received a letter from the Canadian ministry, foreign ministry, asking me to join a trade event that was going to come to Reykjavik, and would I sing in a recital and a reception. So I agreed to do that, and my picture was in the paper with the article about the coming trade show. So when I went out the next day after the concert, I got in a taxi to go, and when I came to the end of the ride, I went to pay the driver, and he looked over his shoulder and he said, "You're a Guttorm's granddaughter. I'm not going to charge you." I was amazed. Everybody knows of it. So, but the English-speaking people in Canada didn't. So what I did is I decided to publish a book in translation of as many poems as I could get. So I wrote to some Icelandic writers and translators and asked them if they could give me any material, and a number did, but I needed to go to others who had not yet done much translation of his poetry, and I collected, in the end, 44 of his poems, and I published it in the 1993 book called Aurora, or Aurora, because one of his poems has that title, and secondly, Aurora is the goddess of the dawn. So Aurora, the book, is awakening the Canadians to the poems of Ave. So that book was published, and then we discovered that the plays had never been translated. It happened over coffee with Bjarnadóttir. I said there was no translations of Ave's plays. And she said, "That's a disgrace." That was your words. And fast forward, a translation of Tia Likrit, 10 plays, was published in 2015. Good. So the Icelandic government and the University of Iceland have talked about strengthening the ties between Canada and Iceland. The arts, especially literature and music, play significant roles. So I think that having a poet in both that is Icelandic translated to English is moving that project further along. I met and knew Haraldur Bessason in days gone by, and he wrote in the 10 Likrit book he said, "In literary history, both Canada and Iceland will lay claims to Guttormson's books. This twofold claim is in itself of the highest order. It is only given to those whose achievement transcends the limitations of both language and geography." So Guttormson's name on the annual international lecture series here at the University of Iceland is well deserved. I thank you. Takk fyrir.
Já, takk kærlega, Heiðir Alda, for a wonderful, wonderful speech. Well, it is also a great honor to introduce the speaker of the 2024 Guttorms J. Guttormsson lecture. As noted by the rector, it was the Canadian poet, classicist, translator, and essayist Anne Carson who inaugurated the lecture series last year. This time around, it is a theater scholar who will give the lecture, and for a good reason, I think. Magnús Þór Þorbergsson, he studied comparative literature at the University of Iceland and theater studies at the Free University in Berlin. His PhD thesis focused on the shaping of a theatrical field in Iceland and the role of theater in developing a modern bourgeois cultural identity from 1850 to 1930. A fascinating topic. Following its completion in 2017, Magnús received a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Iceland, investigating the history of theater among Icelandic settlers in North America. Magnús is a former co-convener of the IFTR Historiography Working Group and the former president of the Association of Nordic Theatre Scholars. Magnús was an assistant professor and program director of theatre and performance making at the Iceland University of the Arts from 2005 to 2015. And as noted again by the rector, he currently works as senior dramaturg of the Reykjavik City Theatre. In his lecture, Dr. Magnús Þór Þorbergsson will draw on his postdoctoral research and look at the various routes and pathways of dramatic writing among Icelandic settlers, both those that crossed the Atlantic from Iceland as well as the ones written by the settlers, and how these routes and pathways shed a light on the multifaceted and vast network of the Icelandic settler culture that weaves through North America from the Great Lakes region all the way to the Pacific coast. As to be expected, Guttormur, the playwright, will enter the picture. However, as Magnús will discuss, what this history reveals is that Guttormur's avant-garde plays are not only unique in their form and content, a subject, if I may add, that has been explored and written about, including text by the Canadian writer and translator Elín Þórðarson, Dr. Sveinn Einarsson, who is with us here today, and Vigdís Finnbódóttir, who is also a good friend of Heather Alda's. As Magnús will reveal, the routes of Guttormur's unique plays were also different from the others. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Magnús Þór Þorbergsson.
Thank you. Takk fyrir Birna. It's a great honor to be invited to give a lecture in this series, but I have to admit I feel a little bit embarrassed, especially by the introduction, because I will not be talking about Guttormur. Very little, at least. And it may sound almost sacrilegious in a lecture in the Guttormsson lecture series to start by saying that in the history of theater, at least the kind of community theater of Icelandic settlers that I've been investigating, the playwright Guttormur Guttormsson plays an insignificant role. This may sound even more peculiar when we consider that Guttormur is one of the very few Icelandic Canadian playwrights whose plays have been available in publication. Also, his plays, like Birna mentioned, are quite extraordinary, and hardly any other Icelandic-speaking playwright in the early 20th century, whether in North America or in Iceland, wrote anything resembling to his plays. Among Icelandic Canadian playwrights, he is the one that has received most attention from scholars, from Birna, from Sveinn, from others, and the republication of his 10 plays in 2015 underline how remarkable and important his plays are in the literary history. But the fact remains that there is practically no evidence of his plays ever being performed during his lifetime, which makes him, in the eyes of the theater historian, perhaps of less interest. The route of his plays was pretty straightforward. He wrote the plays, they were published, and they were there. They didn't move around as the ones that I want to look at today. Guttorm's plays have thus circulated in a network or a cultural system that lies outside of that of the network of theater that I'm concentrating on. They've been read but not performed. They may certainly have had their effect on other playwrights. In fact, we have some evidence of his influence on Icelandic Canadian playwrights, particularly Jóhannes P. Pálsson. In a letter to Guttormur on the 3rd of December 1924, Jóhannes wrote that the editor of Heimskringla had asked him for a contribution to the paper's Christmas edition. And Jóhannes writes, "I had a theme in mind which I had been carrying around for over a year. I therefore swiftly put together a short play and sent it to Heimskringla. 2 days later, I realized that I had written the play à la Guttormur, as the French say. I have come to love your playwriting, and I imitate you, sometimes unknowingly. But I'm not famous, and I have nothing to lose. I'm not ashamed to follow your genius." Now, his short play, simply called Jólin, or Christmas, was published in the Christmas edition of Heimskringla, December 17th, 1924, with a note at the end saying, "Sitting at the feet of our greatest contemporary playwright, Guttorms J. Guttormsson, with apologies, JPP." Now, Jóhannes P. Pálsson, a few of his plays were published in papers, in magazines, and some of them were also performed during his lifetime. But from the letters Jóhannes P. Pálsson wrote to Guttormur, it is clear that Jóhannes was very frustrated by the lack of interest the Icelandic settlers showed to Guttormur's playwriting. In a letter from November 1960, when they were both around 80 years of age, Jóhannes lamented that what he considered a poor cultural sense of the Icelandic Canadian community. He says, "Let's take the theatre among the Icelandic settlers. Has anything been done to bring your plays to the stage? Would it have been too costly or too much of an effort?" He then concludes by pointing out that no one, not even Guttormur himself, really recognized the dramatic genius of Guttormur. And his frustration is understandable, particularly considering the vast number of short and long plays that had in fact been performed by Icelandic settler communities in North America. In the last couple of decades of the 19th century and the early 20th century, evidence of theatre productions can be found in nearly every single location where groups of Icelandic migrants settled. This is a map of the places that I have found through my research where we can find evidence of theatrical productions, from Chicago through the Canadian prairies and the upper Midwest United States to the Pacific coast in Washington and British Columbia, as well as a few cases in Utah. The first of these performances took place around 1880, and the last examples of theatre in Icelandic and Canada can be found in the early 1950s. Now, these productions were produced by amateurs, and there seems to have been no specific intention or longing to create a professional theatre among the Icelandic immigrants, despite the spread and number of production. And responsible for these performances were various societies, such as lodges of the temperance movement, churches, women's associations, literature societies, student associations, and occasionally amateur drama societies were formed, particularly after 1920, that did not have any formal link to other associations. Quite often, perhaps even in the majority of cases, these theatre productions were intended not solely as entertainment, but as fundraising events to support, for example, the building of community halls, schools, churches, or to support sick or poor members of the community. Plays were staged as standalone events, but also often as a part of an evening of entertainment, of music, singing, reading, and lectures, which could include both short acts and full-length plays. Particularly in the smaller rural communities, drama was offered as a part of a box social, a popular type of event in this region, where women would fill a decorated box with a dinner for two, and the men would bid on these boxes, anticipating a dinner with the creator of the box. We might be tempted to call it a tinderbox, but one example of such an evening included a number of lectures, poetry readings, the auction of the dinner boxes and the consequent meal, singing, and then finally a performance of a full-length comedy, which eventually came to an end around 5 in the morning, after which there was dancing. And the plays produced ranged from plays imported from Iceland, both by Icelandic playwrights and translations made especially by the Icelandic settlers. But a fairly large portion of these plays were original scripts written by members of the local communities, even though there was clearly not a lot of interest to perform Guttorm's unique plays. But if we look at the original plays that were performed, we can see that the history of theatre among Icelandic settlers contains several playwrights that have received little or no attention in the histories of literature, mostly due to the fact that their plays were never published. Furthermore, most of these plays, or practically all of them, have never been performed in Iceland and thus have not become a part of the history of Icelandic literature or theatre. Instead, they circulated among Icelandic communities in North America, some of them being performed more often than many Icelandic plays. So I would like to take you on a tour today, following movements along the routes of Icelandic settler theatre in North America, focusing on 3 main examples. Firstly, the plays of a fairly well-known Icelandic-Canadian writer, whose plays are forgotten. Secondly, the circulation of a manuscript brought from Iceland in the luggage of a scholarly farmer from Eyjafjörður. And thirdly, the practice of touring amongst amateur theatre groups of Icelandic settlers. Now, we may, of course, look at these types of immigrant community theatres as an important venue to stage and represent the issues of the community and investigate what role theatre plays in staging and defining communal or ethnic identities of the immigrant group, in preserving or inventing the cultural roots of the community, to preserve the original language and maintain ties to the homeland. Immigrant community theatre provides us with a tool to investigate how the community has dealt with issues of migration, of cultural exchange, encounter with foreigners, images of the self and the other. But I want, however, to look away from what is actually happening on stage, what issues are being addressed in particular plays and performances, but instead to take a look at geographical mapping, mobility, and networks, which to my mind reveal how the community theatre plays a part in creating a sense of belonging, basically creating a community. But let's start with the hidden playwright by the well-known author, Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason. He's one of the better-known writers of Icelandic-Canadian literature. Born in Iceland in 1866, died in Elfros, Saskatchewan in 1945. Jóhann Magnús emigrated to Canada with his parents when he was 9 years old. At first, they lived in Markland in Nova Scotia, but moved to Winnipeg in 1882. Jóhann Magnús finished a teacher education in Winnipeg and worked most of his life as a teacher in Manitoba and North Dakota, with the exception of a couple of years when he worked as an office clerk in Vancouver. He moved around quite a lot. It's interesting to see his movement around the map. But Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason published poetry, short stories, and novels during his lifetime, and is best known for his number of novels depicting the life of Icelandic settlers in Canada. He is less known for his playwriting, which may sound perplexing, considering the fact that he is one of the most, if not the most, prolific playwright to ever write in Icelandic. And one of the most performed, although his plays have never been staged in Iceland. While Guttorm J. Guttormsson is certainly better known and studies as a playwright, Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason plays a more important role in the history of theatre among the Icelandic settlers in North America. Guttorm was published but not performed. Jóhann Magnús was performed but not published. The 2 first plays that Jóhann Magnús wrote were, however, presumably never staged. The first one was called Laugardagskvöld, Saturday Night, written shortly after he came to Winnipeg, around 16 or 17 years of age. He wrote a second play around 1887 called Skipbrotsmaðurinn, The Castaway. But after an acquaintance of his told him that even though it was fairly well written, it would never be performed, he decided to burn the manuscript. So that was that. His first play to be performed was Styrjöldin í Algeir, The War in Algiers, staged by the Women's Association of Gimli on December 27, 1890. And only 2 weeks later, his play Hertoginn í Hamburg, The Duke of Hamburg, was performed in Geysir, Manitoba. Over the following 15 years, Jóhann Magnús wrote over 20 more plays, most of which were played in Geysir, where he worked as a teacher from 1894 to 1903. And one of his pupils there who also participated in some of the productions, was the aforementioned Johannes P. Pálsson. It's interesting to look at what was happening in theatre in Iceland during the years Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason wrote his plays between 1890 and 1905. There were performances both in Gutto, the Good Templar house, and in the theatre Fjallakötturinn in the early 1890s, where a couple of Icelandic plays could be seen. Leikfélag Reykjavíkur, the Reykjavik Theatre Company, was founded in 1897, but only performed one Icelandic play in their first decade. There was a competition held in Reykjavik in the early 1890s, calling for new Icelandic plays, but the deadline had to be extended twice because no plays were submitted. At the end, none of the 4 plays finally submitted to the competition was deemed worthy of the prize. So the plays of Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason not only make him the most performed Icelandic playwright of the period, his more than 20 plays, in fact, make up the bulk of Icelandic drama during this time. Around the turn of the century, around 1900, Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason had become a known playwright among the Icelandic settler communities in Manitoba and North Dakota, and cultural societies and other associations of Icelandic settlers that were responsible for theatre performances in the region increasingly contacted him looking for plays. He responded to such requests either by sending one of his older plays or writing a new play. As a consequence, some of his plays circulated among Icelandic settler communities for several years. We can take an example, the play called Vinirnir, The Friends, from around 1900. There's Winnipeg, there's North Dakota. The first production of Vinirnir was in Selkirk in 1900. There was a second production in Arnes in 1903, a third production in Árdal in 1904, in Framnes in the same year, in Holson, North Dakota in 1904 as well, then 1906 in Marshland, and in the same year there is a group in Big Point that staged this play, and finally there's a production in Framnes again in 1915. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 productions of the play in 15 years. That's pretty well done. When we consider how many plays Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason wrote and how often some of them, especially his later plays, were staged, it may sound remarkable that he has not been considered having made an important contribution to Icelandic playwriting. In fact, in literary history, his drama is practically never mentioned. There is perhaps a simple explanation for this. Most of the plays ended their journey in the author's fireplace. Jóhann Magnús mentions in his diary that he tends to burn most of his plays as soon as they have been performed once or twice. This may have been the case of most of his plays, but surely not all of them. If we look at the circulation of a play like Vinirnir, it is certain that it existed in a few manuscripts. It had been copied and distributed and copied again. One of these manuscripts may have ended its journey in an attic or basement somewhere in Manitoba. So far, however, I've only managed to find a single manuscript of one of his plays, a play called Oft fer sá vilt sem geta skal, which he wrote in 4 days in November 1902. It was performed a couple of weeks later in Geysir, so the rehearsal period was not that long. After which Jóhann Magnús worked a little more on the script before sending it to his cousin in Garðar, North Dakota, where it was performed in December 1903. Now, this is clearly one of the plays that the author did not burn, In 1924, it was staged in the town of Mozart, Saskatchewan, close to Elfros, where Jóhann Magnús had moved in 1922. His neighbor in Elfros, by the way, was his former pupil, Jóhannes P. Pálsson. It comes up every now and then. The manuscript of the play was hidden away in a collection of manuscripts from Jóhannes P. Pálsson in the National Library next door, and I assume that Jóhannes saved it from ending up in Jóhann Magnús's fireplace. There is one interesting thing to note about the circulation of Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason's plays among the Icelandic communities in Manitoba and North Dakota. If we look at where they were performed, for example, this play Vinirnir, we notice that none of his plays were ever performed in Winnipeg, which in many ways has been considered the cultural center of Icelandic Canadians. His plays traveled between the smaller communities, Geysir, Selkirk, Holson, Garðar, without ever stopping in Winnipeg. Even though there was a lot of theatrical activity in Winnipeg, with papers such as Lögberg and Heimskringla writing lengthy reviews about the productions performed there, this sort of decentralization is actually quite common when we look at the circulation rather than the centralized venues. This is also evident in the second example I would like to look at, which focuses on a manuscript moving around in the luggage of an Icelandic emigrant from Eyjafjörður, Sigluvíkur Jónas. In 1899, the Icelandic National Library bought a manuscript from Jónas Jónsson, who was then resident at the farm Hrísar in northern Eyjafjörður. The manuscript contained 16 plays, 6 adaptations of comedies by Ludvig Holberg, and 10 original plays by 9 authors. This compilation is quite remarkable, not only for being a very rare collection of plays from late 19th century Iceland, but also when we look at the route it traveled to arrive finally in the manuscript collection of the National Library. Now, Jónas Jónsson was born in 1828 and he died in 1907, and he's most often named after the place where he was born, Sigluvíkur Jónas. Apparently, Jónas was not much of a farmer, but more of a bookish folk scholar. So following a few failed attempts in farming, he worked as a teacher in various places in Eyjafjörður. In July 1884, shortly after the death of his wife, Jónas wrote a farewell letter to the local paper Norðanfari, announcing his emigration to America, where he intended to spend the rest of his life among friends and relatives. There is not much known about his stay in North America. We know that he stayed in Ontario until 1885 and was subsequently resident in the newly established village of Cavalier in North Dakota. His plans to spend the rest of his life in America clearly changed, however, as he moved back to Iceland in 1890 after a 6-year stay in America. According to the title page of the manuscript that you can see on the picture, it was compiled by Jónas sometime during his first winter of immigration. The title reads, Play Collection of Jónas Jónsson in Cardwell, Muskoka, Ontario, Canada, written in the winter of 1884 to 1885. In 1899, when Jónas sold the manuscript to the National Library, he also attached a register of the plays, which included a few notes on authorship and, in some cases, of performances. Now, of the 16 plays in the collection, 6 are translations or adaptations of Holberg's comedies. 3 of them were translated by Jónas himself, Jeppe på Bjargað, Jeppe á Fjalli, Jeppe on the Hill, Masquerade, and Kilreisen. One is an adaptation of Barselstuen, or the maternity room, by Ólafur Ólafsson, and 2 are adaptations by Tómas Jónasson from Hróarsstaðir, Den Stuðningslausu, or I think it's called The Fidget in English, and Pernilla's Korte Frökenstand, Pernilla's Brief Ladyship. 2 of the original plays are also by Tómas Jónasson, Vinirnir, eða Úthýsingin, The Friends of the Expulsion, and Yfirdómarinn, The Prefect. Other plays are Hermóður and Helga, The Vesturfarin, The Emigrant, and Oddur Snikkari, Oddur the Cabinet Maker by Ari Jónsson, Galdraleifi, Leifur the Sorcerer by Guðmundur Davíðsson, Misskilningurinn, The Misunderstanding by Kristján Jónsson, Afturgangan, The Ghost by Kristján Brím, Jólaleifi, The Christmas Leaf by his brother Valdimar Brím, and Ekki alla ferðir til fjár, Not All Journeys Are for the Good by Páll Jónsson. Now, the plays and the authors have a couple of things in common. First of all, the authors or the translators or adapters are all originated from or were resident in the area around the town of Akureyri. Ólafur Ólafsson was from Espihóll, Ari Jónsson from Víðigerði, Páll Jónsson from Helgastaðir, the Brím brothers from Grund. These were all farms south in the valley south of Akureyri. Tómas Jónasson from Hróarsstaðir and Guðmundur Davíðsson from Reykir were from Fnjóskadalur, just east of the mountains. So the collection, therefore, is a key source of the dramatic endeavors of the people of Eyjafjörður in the late 19th century. Most of the plays were also performed in Akureyri or elsewhere in Eyjafjörður before 1900, but have rarely, if ever, been performed outside the region of Eyjafjörður. Some of the Holberg comedies, of course, have been performed elsewhere, but not in these versions that we see in the script. To be correct, they have hardly been performed in Iceland outside of Eyjafjörður. Many of these plays were, however, performed among Icelandic settlers in North America, some of them quite often, and in various locations. In 1884, when Jónas Jónsson arrived in Canada, the Icelandic settlers had staged the occasional play. The first Icelandic theater performance in North America that we know of took place in 1880 when the play Sigríður Eyjafjarðarsól was staged in Winnipeg, written by the same Ari Jónsson, who also wrote 3 of the plays in Jónas's collection. The play was originally performed in Eyjafjörður in 1876, and as with most of the plays in Jónas's collection, Sigríður Eyjafjarðarsól has, to my knowledge, never been performed outside of Eyjafjörður. But it was staged in various places among Icelandic settlers in North America. The same play was staged again, for example, in Winnipeg in 1881. Again, 1880 in Winnipeg, 1881 again. And we know, however, for certain that the North Dakota Icelanders started staging plays in 1881 when Stefán G. Stefánsson was asked to write a play for an Icelandic festival in the North Dakota village of Garðar. In the spring of 1885, a performance of Sigríður Eyjafjarðarsól took place in Garðar, and a group called the Hallsson Amateur Theatrical Society performed a play called Alaskaferðin, a trip to Alaska, in the neighboring village of Hallsson at the same time. So the first few years of the 1880s show a rather slow start in the dramatic endeavors of the Icelandic settlers, but in the year 1885, the year Jónas Jónsson arrives in North Dakota, the theatrical seems to have taken off, particularly in North Dakota. A news report from Garðar, published in Lögberg in April 1888, states that 4 to 5 plays were staged over the passing winter in the region, and 1 or 2 more were in preparation. There's not always clear evidence to be found which plays were performed on these occasions, but according to letters and reports in the Icelandic papers of Winnipeg, these were in some occasions original plays written by the settlers, a few popular published Icelandic plays such as Skuggasveinn. But furthermore, a number of the plays performed among the Icelanders in North Dakota over the following decade are to be found in Jónas Jónsson's manuscript. Tómas Jónsson's play, The Friends, Vinirnir, the Úthýsingin, was performed on several occasions, as was his adaptation of Holberg's Den Stundeslöse, The Fidget. Ari Jónsson's The Emigrant was performed at least once in 1891, and we have evidence of at least 3 productions of Kristján Jónsson's play, The Misunderstanding, Misskilningurinn. As there are indications of more performances taking place than were named in the press, one might speculate that more of the plays of Jónas' collections were performed in North Dakota during the period. In his register, he notes that some of the plays were performed there, even though I have not managed to find clear evidence of all these productions. It seems only likely that they took place in the area where Jónas lived during the period. The manuscript of Jónas Jónsson's collection of play thus may be said to have been a key source of material for the community theatre of Icelanders in North Dakota and a major catalyst for these endeavors. The effect of his manuscript can also be seen beyond the Icelandic settlement in North Dakota. A number of the plays of the collection started to appear in the community halls and assembly houses in other Icelandic settlements in the following years. And since these plays were never published, it is most likely that they were copied from Jónas's collection and distributed to other groups of Icelandic settlers. The clearest example of one of the more popular plays from the collection is Thomas Jónasson adaptations of Holberg's Den Stundislösen. The play was first performed among Icelandic settlers in North America in 1885 in Holson in North Dakota. And in 1889, we see two performances of the play, one in Winnipeg and another one in Garðar in North Dakota. In 1891, the play is staged in Hnausa on the shore of Lake Winnipeg, and in 1894 in Brú in the district of Argyll. In 1897, it is performed in Riverton, where it was apparently performed again, sometimes after 1909. And in the same year, 1897, it is shown in Markerville in Alberta. 1899, there's a performance of the play in Hekla Island, after which there is not clear evidence of the play's production until 1913, when it is staged in Accra in North Dakota, and in 1914 in Selkirk, Manitoba, and then in 1914 in the district of Ballard in Seattle. And again, there's a production in Markerville in 1915. Now, these are only the production of the play of which I have found clear evidence. There may have been more productions. Now, there were other Icelandic translations of Holberg's comedy, Den Stundislöse, in existence in the 19th century. This comedy by Holberg is one of the first plays to be performed in Reykjavik in 1849 by pupils of the Latin School. We can assume, however, that the translation used in the Icelandic production in North America is the one by Thomas Jónasson, as it was in every case referred to by the title he chose, Ebenezer og Anríkið, Ebenezer and the Business, and not the more direct translation, Sá önnum kafni, or Tímaleysingin, which was the title that was used in 1849 and in the subsequent Reykjavik productions. So when Jónas Jónsson moved back to Iceland in 1890, he clearly took his collection of plays with him and eventually sold it to the National Library in 1899. However, as we can see clearly here, copies of some of the plays from his collection continued to circulate between the Icelandic settlements well into the 20th century, from North Dakota to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, even to Seattle on the west coast. Looking at the route of the manuscript provides us with a couple of insights into networks and exchange in cultural history. Firstly, we see how influence is literally carried across borders in material luggage, in this case a manuscript, and how the luggage of a single individual can have a huge impact on cultural developments of a whole ethnic group. Secondly, it also shifts our perspective away from a focus on exchange between centers, between Reykjavik and Winnipeg, to the peripheral regions, in this case, the influence from Eyjafjörður to Pembina County in North Dakota. And thirdly, it gives us an indication of how certain texts are copied, rewritten, and distributed. We can see several further examples of how luggage of single individuals can contain new sparks of influence. Sigurður Magnússon, one of the founding members of Leikfélag Reykjavíkur, the Reykjavik Theatre Company, emigrated to Canada around 1900 after having been drunk on stage in Reykjavik. And shortly after his arrival, we can see some of the plays from the first couple of years of Leikfélag Reykjavíkur emerge on the stage in Winnipeg. Another example, Einar H. Kvaran moved to Canada in 1885, straight from his studies in Copenhagen, and immediately formed an amateur theatre group, staging comedies that he brought from Denmark. He also brought some manuscripts with him when he moved back to Iceland in 1895. For example, the play Esmeralda by William Gillette, which he directed at Leikfélag Reykjavíkur in 1899. He had translated and directed the same play in Winnipeg in 1888. So we have had a look at the circulation of plays and manuscript in the case of Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason and the influence of a manuscript of Sigluvíkur Jónas. But finally, I would like to bring up some example of the movement of the theater groups themselves. As you can see from the map, the Icelandic settlements were somewhat dispersed. There are some clusters, especially in Manitoba. There are clusters in specific areas, the New Iceland region on the shore of Lake Winnipeg, Pembina County in North Dakota, the Quill Lakes area in Saskatchewan. In fact, we can use the history of Icelandic settler community theater to track the Icelandic migration in Canada and the US. Evidence can be found of theater productions in Winnipeg, New Iceland, and North Dakota in the 1880s, spreading westwards across Manitoba to towns such as Argyll, Glenborough, Shoal Lake in the 1890s, and to the Quill Lakes in Saskatchewan in the beginning of the 20th century. The development of theater activities of the Icelandic settlers in North America noticeably do not show much tendency towards centralization or institutionalization. Like I said before, although Winnipeg may clearly have been said to be some sort of center to the Icelandic communities, as the city was home to the 2 Icelandic-speaking newspapers and the largest community of Icelandic Canadians live there, when it came to theater, it was not necessarily a point of reference. Like we saw in the cases of Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason and the manuscript of Sigluvíkur Jónas. Instead, the network of the dispersed amateur actors seemed to have been more important than the idea of a center which they all could refer to. Winnipeg was certainly the place where we find most evidence of theater productions, perhaps due to the fact that the Icelandic Winnipeg newspapers published more reports of theater productions happening there than elsewhere. But as we have seen in the previous cases, not nearly all plays produced among the Icelandic settlers were originally performed in Winnipeg. When the amateur theater groups of the Icelandic settlers start moving around with their performances, touring between the settlements in the 1890s, it becomes clear that Winnipeg is by no means of central importance. The first documented case of a group traveling between communities to perform is from the settlements and township in Pembina County, in the northeast corner of North Dakota. A report in the weekly Lögberg, published in Winnipeg, it tells of a few plays being staged in the winter of 1888 to 1889 in the county, some of which were performed by the same group of actors in several locations. Although these settlements were not very far from each other, the distance between Milton and Hallsson, for example, is around 30 kilometers, it still must count as one of the first attempts of touring. Throughout the 1890s, numerous cases of such short tours can be traced. Groups would travel between the North Dakota communities in Pembina County or between the settlements along the shore of Lake Winnipeg, from Riverton south to Selkirk. Or as the Icelandic migrants moved farther west, we can see short tours around the South Cyprus region from Glenborough to Baldur and around the Quill Lakes in Saskatchewan, along the line from Kandahar through Wynyard to Mozart and Leslie. This announcement from the early 1920s serves as one of the many examples. The Wynyard Drama Society announces performances of the one-act play Útburðurinn, The Outcast by Jóhannes P. Pálsson, and the two-act comedy Apinn, The Monkey, probably by the Danish Johanne Louise Heiberg, although the name of the author is not mentioned. For 3 consecutive days, the 2 plays were performed in Wynyard and 2 of its neighboring villages, Leslie and Elfros. It's a very short distance to travel, basically. But the tours were not solely focused on serving the neighboring communities. Already in the 1890s, there are evidence to be found of touring between the community clusters. One of the earliest cases is from a group from Pembina visiting Winnipeg to perform an unnamed play by Valdimar Briem. I assume it's Jólaleiðið from Sigluvíkur Jónas' manuscript. It was performed on the 29th and 30th of January 1892. In what was probably the first tour to be organized across the US-Canadian border, the group had to travel 120 kilometers across the border in a week when temperatures fell down to 20 below zero. And in the first decades of the 20th century, touring seems to have been a self-evident part of the amateur theater activities of North American Icelanders. By the time Guðrún Indriðadóttir, one of the actresses of Leikfélag Reykjavíkur, visited Winnipeg in 1913 to perform her famous role of Halla in Jóhann Sigurjónsson's Fjallaeyvindur with the local amateur drama society, the tour took her to many of the townships along the shore of Lake Winnipeg, as well as to North Dakota communities in Pembina County. And then when the other prima donna of Leikfélag Reykjavíkur, Stefania Guðmundsdóttir, was invited to Winnipeg in 1920, the touring network had expanded, taking her 3 times to the communities in the New Iceland region, twice to Saskatchewan and North Dakota. And on her way back to Iceland, she stopped to perform in the village of Minneota in the state of Minnesota. If we take a bit closer look at the map of these clusters of communities, for example, in Pembina County, one question immediately springs to mind. If we take a look at this advertisement from 1901, it's an advertisement of a group from Winnipeg touring to Pembina County to perform a very popular Danish comedy called Ævintýr á gönguför, Adventures on a walking trip. They advertised that they were coming to Pembina County, and the 3 places listed in the advertisements are located within a 15-kilometer radius, approximately equivalent to the distance from here to the outskirts of Hafnarfjörður or Mosfellsbær. They can be reached on a bicycle in 1 hour 14 minutes, according to Google Maps. Garðar Mountain, Holson. Now, distances between the localities in the New Iceland region on the shore of Lake Winnipeg, between the South Cyprus communities or the town near Saskatchewan Quill Lakes, are about equally short. Today, they can be reached in 10 minutes, 20-minute drive, maybe a 1-hour trot on horseback around the turn of the 19th century. And the question I'm faced with is, why bother? Why bother packing down your set, costumes, props, and all to put it up again just in a different location only a few miles down the road? Why not perform in one place and invite the audience to come there? There are documented cases of people traveling, for example, from Selkirk to Winnipeg to attend a theater performance. That's 35 kilometers. But the traveling groups, both the local ones and the ones coming in from other regions, would normally perform in 2 to 4, even more places in each of these clustered regions. So they would perform one night rather than focusing on the larger centers. It seems to have been a very important part of the touring network to include as many townships and communities as possible. So they would pack it all down, move it to the next community hall, put it all up again. One might say that a traveling group would perform in the community as long as it had a venue large enough to house the performance and an audience. So instead of giving 5 performances in Mountain, for example, the group would perform there twice again in Garðar, and once in Holson, in a total of 5 consecutive evenings. I would argue that the touring network that goes the extra mile to include every township possible serves a purpose. It acknowledges the existence of the single community, and it creates a connection between the dispersed settlements, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the communities in a network that stretches across province, state, and national borders. So the decentralized movement of people, scripts, and groups that we've seen here draws attention to the importance of the network and the connections, which seem more important than what is actually being performed. in including every settlement possible in their tours by exchanging manuscript across regions rather than depending on cultural centers. The amateur theatre network of the Icelandic immigrants in North America was an important part in creating an interconnected community of the immigrant diaspora, basically saying, despite being dispersed, we are one community. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture, Magnús Þór. We do not have too much time for questions because there is a reception waiting upstairs. The idea is also that you can all speak with the 2024 Guttorms J. Guttormsson lecture series lecture. If there is maybe just one question now, if at all. Hulda Karen.
Well, I was thinking about Guttorms' plays.
Yeah.
The reason being behind them not being staged,
Mm-hmm.
they were very complicated. It was a technological barrier, perhaps. What do you say about that?
It might be a technological barrier, or it might be that people have just found them too avant-garde. If we look at what was performed in these communities, it was not very avant-garde. There was a lot of like Danish comedies. There was a lot of Icelandic plays, short, even maybe short scenes that the settlers themselves wrote. So it was more thought of as an entertainment. There's hardly any play that is not a comedy to be found in the whole repertoire of the Icelandic Canadian theatre. So I think it's just that they looked at it and said, what can we do with that? You know?
But today it would be.
Perhaps, yeah.
Thank you, Bob. Unless, yeah, how does this plan sound? We just move up and have some refreshments, and you can please all speak with the lecturers.
One just
Yeah,
short
no,
question.
yeah.
Has the Guttorm, thank you for a lovely speech, has the Guttorm plays been staged in Iceland at all?
No.
They're too avant-garde to do that.
They were performed at an Icelandic national international meeting. Three of them were put on by amateurs, but very well received. They're quite off the wall, and you really have to have a quick imagination to get the jokes, the meaning and all. But yes, they were put on.
In Canada?
Yes,
Yeah.
Vancouver.
Right.
But we did have a little production of flytur in London once going.
Oh, right.
They're put on by students.
We were supported by
Icelandic nation.
Yeah, well, thank you for the feed. So there's also one more note. Heather Alda brought with her copies of a few copies of our ávarp, the great book of Guttorms poetry, in English translation, and her grandchild, Jordan, is her Amma's agent. and those of you who will be interested in purchasing a copy of that book, just speak with Jordan at the reception. So thank you all speakers, and thank you all for being with us, all for